What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. All right, so in this video, I thought it would be fun to do something a little different. I know that there's a lot of talk about whether or not LeBron James can eventually surpass Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and become the all-time leading scorer. I think the all-time leading scoring record in the NBA is kind of similar to the home run record in Major League Baseball. So in this video, I just want to do a timeline of the all-time leading scorer in NBA history in real time, as the 40s progressed all the way through today. So anyway, so this guy pictured right here is named Joe Fulks. All right, Joe Fulks, nicknamed Jumpin' Joe Fulks, was the first star of the NBA. But the NBA back then was called the BAA, or the Basketball Association of America. And during this first season, Joe Fulks led the BAA in scoring. And back then, scoring titles, and most titles were uh, determined not by average, but by total. So whoever scored the most points, I think that was the way it was all the way through like 69, 70. And I think that's when they changed it to scoring average. But Joe Fulks led the BAA in scoring his rookie year, and as he continued to play for several seasons, he stayed the all-time leading scorer all the way through the end of the 1951-52 season. And this was actually a couple of years after the BAA merged with the NBL, which was the National Basketball League, and they officially became the NBA. I think that was in 1949. And Joe Fulks was also the first player to crack 5,000 career points. Now, keep in mind, there were a lot fewer games played back then. I think the season was something. I think their seasons back then were 60 games as opposed to 82 games now. But during the 1952-53 season, uh, Joe Fulks was surpassed by the league's first true superstar, and that superstar's name was George Mikan of the then Minneapolis Lakers. All right, now George Mikan of the Minneapolis Lakers, of course, now the Los Angeles Lakers, won 5 NBA championships with the franchise in the early to mid 1950s. All right, now if you notice on this marquee right here, it says, if you read it closely, it says not Lakers versus Knicks, but George Mikan versus Knicks. And that's to illustrate how big of a star he was during his time. He was the superstar. He was a bona fide superstar. His game, um, was patterned after so many future big men. Um, the fact that, the philosophy that you had to have a big man, a dominant big man to win a title, reigned supreme in the NBA for so many decades after he played, throughout the 1960s into the 1980s. All right, it was George Mikan that created that mantra with NBA owners and general managers and coaches that you had to have a dominant man in the pivot to win titles. And George Mikan helped, to instill that. But um, he was the first NBA player to crack 10,000 career points. Um, he retired after the 1955-56 season after his body broke down early. And I think George Mikan was only 32 years old at the time, 31, 32 years old. But the game was so much more violent and physical back then. Um, but yeah, up until the 1957-58 season, George Mikan was the all-time leading scorer. And he was surpassed by a guy who never actually led the NBA in scoring, but he was always amongst the leaders in the 1950s. And he was, if not my memory serves me correctly, he's the all-time leader in the 1950s as far as points scored, and that would be a guy named Dolph Schayes. Dolph Schayes, I would say Dolph was one of the top five players in the NBA in the 1950s. I would say the top players were George Mikan, Neil Johnston, Bob Cousy, Bob Pettit. Well, I put Bob Pettit ahead of. Uh, actually, I would rank it. I would rank it Bob Pettit, George Mikan, uh, Bob Cousy, Neil Johnston, and then Dolph Schayes. Yeah, I would say that. And Dolph Schayes was also the league's first real Ironman. And here goes Dolph right here. That's Dolph Schayes, and of the Syracuse Nationals, who ultimately became the Philadelphia 76ers in the 1960s. But like I said, Dolph Schayes was a great scorer for his era. I think if he, I know a lot of people are like, come on, Mike. I mean, it's the 1950s. It's almost 2020. I get it. These are a bunch of old white guys that can't play and all that shit, right? But they could play. Um, and they were the best in their times. All right. Uh, but his game would really kind of, I mean, his game kind of would be more suited for today's NBA though, because he was more of an outside shooter who occasionally liked to drive to the basket and had a knack for getting to the foul line. And that does sound like a certain player from Houston. I'm not saying he would be as prolific as James Harden. I'm not saying that, but that kind of was his game, an outside shooter. You know what I'm saying? He loved to shoot what would now be from 3-point range or from, outer mid range and threes. And occasionally, he liked to drive the basket. Back then you paid a price for driving to the basket. You had to earn foul calls. So that's all I'm saying, but Dolph Schayes was the first NBA player to crack 15,000 career points, and he stayed the all-time leading scorer all the way through the 1962-63 NBA season. He would play one more season in a very brief role before he retired at the end of the 1964 season. But it was during the 1963-64 season that Dolph Schayes was overtaken as the all-time leading scorer by another player, even more prolific scorer, whose name was Bob Pettit. Bob Pettit was, for a relatively brief period of time, the most prolific scorer in NBA history. Bob Pettit, like I said, overtook Dolph Schayes during the 1963-64 season, and he retired the very next year during the 1964-65 season. And he became the first NBA player to crack 20,000 career points. He finished at 20,880 points. He led the NBA in scoring twice. And during the 1958-59 season, I believe, he set a record by scoring 2,105 points during the season. But that mark would quickly be, I mean, all of Bob Pettit's prolific scoring marks would soon be wiped out by the greatest force offensively in NBA history. All right. To put into perspective how dominant Wilt Chamberlain was, Wilt came into the league in 1959. Bob Pettit came to the league in 1954. So that would give Pettit a 5-year head start. And even though Pettit passed Dolph Schayes very quickly, Wilt passed Pettit in half the time. So it's like, yeah, Wilt Chamberlain the very next year. Yeah, so Wilt Chamberlain passed Bob Pettit the St. Louis Hawks during the I think it was 1965-66 season. with 21,486 points toward the end of that season. And Wilt Chamberlain, that was it. All the way through the 1980s, Wilt Chamberlain was the all-time leading scorer in NBA history. You know what I'm saying? He passed him during that year. By that period of time, Wilt was averaging, I think for his career, like almost 40 points a game. And as his career progressed, he became more of a complete player. And then by the time with the Lakers, he started focusing more on defense, scoring less. But still, his astronomical scoring during his years with the Philadelphia Warriors, who became the San Francisco Warriors, I think, later on moved to San Francisco. And still, he was putting up big scoring numbers with the Sixers. He finished his career with 31,419 points. He was the first NBA player to crack 25,000 points. And he was the first NBA player to crack 30,000 career points. All right. And I know that Wilt Chamberlain said years later that if he had known that there would have been such, a fuss about scoring record, that he would have probably just stated a dominant scorer, and would have added to his totals. But Kareem Abdul-Jabbar retired during after the 1972-73 season. And his 31,419 points stayed the record for over a decade until Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, during the 1983-84 season, in a game against the Utah Jazz, surpassed Wilt Chamberlain and became the all-time leading scorer.
Everybody's waving their arms. It's into Kareem. Kareem swing left, right hand 12-footer. The pictures tell the words. They love their captain. They love their leader. And suffice to say, ladies and gentlemen, the new king of scoring has ascended his throne.
Kareem Abdul-Jabbar will go on to play another 5 NBA seasons before retiring at the end of the 1988-89 season, his 20th season in the NBA. He finished with 38,387 points. And that is still the NBA record. And it's the longest period of time for a singular player to have a record such as this. Wilt surpassed Bob Pettit